this thing working? It sounds as if is it working? It's working, great. Good morning, welcome to the AAC. My name's Gerald. I say that because there are a few faces that I'm not real familiar with, but I'm delighted to see you all. We're going to roll in 1 or 2 minutes here. There are just some people signing in right now. We'll let them catch up. There are a couple of windows back there that are cracked, and I think if people want to smoke, it's fine. Was everybody told that it would be a good idea if you're smoking to sit in the back of the room, and then it all goes that way, and the pure of heart can sit towards the front? So if that doesn't, if you're in the wrong position, now's a good time to move. Brian, you're and Billy all set? Oh, good, Fatima. Front row, almost center. Okay, we're very fortunate in my estimation, and we must be in yours as well, to have David Mayo here for a whole day. And I'm not going to take a lot of time to introduce him because I don't think he needs it. David?
Well, good morning. The main thing that I hope to accomplish today is to make it more easy and more possible for people to use auditing in situations that they run into in life. Now, auditing seems very complex at times, lots of rules and lots of exactly right ways to do it. And we're often given the impression that there are lots of ways to do it wrong. It's actually not that difficult, and I hope to be able to get across that it's actually very simple. So let's start off with looking at what auditing is. Basically, it's, in very simplified terms, it's two people. One talks to the other, and charge comes off. Most of you do it all the time. I shouldn't say all the time, but most of you do it quite frequently without realizing it. And that's in its most simplified form, which is listening to someone when they've got their attention on something that concerns or bothers them. Sometimes we do that better, and sometimes we don't do it as well. And the idea is to do it when you do it, to do it well, not by getting into a lot of rules that you need to know about how to listen to somebody, but simply by paying attention to what the person's saying. Now that alone would make it a lot easier to have somebody tell you about a problem or worry and walk away feeling relieved. There are many situations, say at work or in married life, in a family, where one of the parties has something that's bothering them, and somebody else, if they listen to the person successfully, would ease the person's mind about it. It mightn't do a great deal for it, but sometimes it's of very vast and tremendous benefit to just have somebody that you can talk to. Could make the difference between going around the bend, for example, in a tight situation, or it could give one a sense of security and well-being generally in life to know that you have somebody that you can talk to. And I think that's the most basic form of auditing there is enabling another person simply to tell you what's on their mind or what their attention is on. And provided you do just that, it'll work very satisfactorily. When you try to do something, such as to run a process or to ask the person questions about it, at that point, then you need to know a little bit more about what you're doing. If somebody has something on their mind and you simply listen to it, then that's all you need to do. We can get into acknowledgements also, but actually, if you just listen to somebody who has something that they want to communicate, that means quite a lot. So that's the very first and most simple thing that we'd like to start off by making a point about. Now, when I make one of these points, we're going to do some practical as we go along. We might do a little drilling at times, and we might do some actual auditing. No one to find out if that's acceptable to everybody here. The type of auditing that you'll be doing would be non-grade chart auditing. In other words, we won't be doing something out of a particular grade or level, so it would be okay for anybody to do it or to receive it. So does everybody agree to that? If you have any particular concern about, oh, should I do this one or should I be run on that, then you can let somebody know, and one of the, either myself or one of the staff here will take that up with you. And in terms of doing something practical, I know this seems too simple for words, but I want to start off with getting everybody to listen to somebody, which I don't think is going to do anyone any harm. Unless they get somebody who has so much on their mind that might prevent you from doing the rest of the seminar. But it doesn't look like there's anyone like that today. And attitude, when you're listening to somebody, attitude makes quite a lot of difference. So I want to cover that. We've often heard a datum, which is that you shouldn't sympathize, or that you shouldn't sympathize with the PC, or some variation of how one shouldn't sympathize. And I feel that that particular idea has often been misduplicated to such a degree sometimes that people, in their misapplication of it, have tended to build up quite a lot of bypass charge at times on other people. Now, sympathy in itself is an emotion, just as other things are emotions. And we could make a big issue about how one shouldn't get angry. And we could repeat that quite frequently, and then people would all walk around agreeing that getting angry was something that one should be very careful to avoid, and that one shouldn't do it. And I think that to some degree the idea of being sympathetic has gotten into that category where people have gotten very careful to try not to be sympathetic. Now, sympathy itself, as I said, is simply an emotion, or sometimes it's an attitude, a sympathetic attitude. In itself, it's not wrong. Now, if you have the means whereby you can help somebody effectively, then to just sympathize would not be particularly effective. In other words, if somebody came and told you that they had something bothering them, and you sympathized with them, and walked off and left them with the thing bothering them, when you could have, and here's the other element of it, when you could have done something more for the person, then you would have done them a disservice. Not particularly by sympathizing, but by not doing something effective. And I think that's where the emphasis should be. It should be, the rule should be stated more something like, don't sympathize when you could do something effective. Or don't leave it at sympathy when you could do something more for the person. Now, the danger with some of the misduplication that's happened on the subject of sympathizing is that I think we've all, to a large degree, over the years, built up a false datum on the subject of sympathy. I know I had for quite a long period of time, to a point where when somebody tried to tell me something, I would be so careful not to sympathize that I would actually put across a different attitude of no sympathy, or worse yet, possibly becoming uncaring or not caring about another person. Now, caring about another person is a form of responsibility. If you care for someone or something to that degree, you're showing a willingness to be responsible for it. It also relates to, it's more definitely relates to affinity. You care for people or care for things that you like. And in fact, I think caring and liking are so synonymous that it would be impossible to have one without the other. Now, the reason I'm covering this is that as we go along and do our various actions today, I'd like to get off any false datums that you may have run into in the past, because I think we may end up finding out at the end of today that it wasn't so much what you had to learn as what you had to shed in order to make it possible to do these things. So what I'd like to do now, as the very first little drill here, is I'd like you to get you to listen to somebody. And we won't do this for very long, but we will do it a bit. And when you do it with an attitude not of no sympathy. This is getting real tricky. But I'd like you to do it without being unsympathetic. Now, we could do it, we could state it more positively and say that you could listen to another person and show that you care about what they're saying, but I don't want you to fake it or force it. In other words, I don't want you to sort of put that across as something. I just want you to do it simply and frankly and sincerely, just the way you feel. So when I get you to listen to what somebody else tells you, I want you to simply listen to it. You don't have to be BGIs, and you don't have to add any extra interest other than what's already there. Just do it completely naturally and simply, but without doing any of this no sympathy stuff. Okay? And without trying to acknowledge particularly. I don't want you to try to use any acts or acknowledgements. We're just doing the listen part. But when you've heard the person, just let them know, that you've heard it, and let it reflect your actual attitude. In other words, you don't have to restrain. If somebody says, if what the person tells you is that they broke their leg and it hurts like hell to walk on it, you can let them know how you feel about that, or what your attitude or what your response was in hearing that. Even if it was, gee, that's too bad, I hope the other one still works, or or whatever. So this one is going to be a pretty short one, right? And I think we'll double it up with another one, with the next action that we're going to do. And so I'll cover that a little bit more now, because I think we need to do it before we do the first one on listening, and that is the idea that you can harm somebody by auditing them. Now actually it doesn't, or it's very difficult to harm somebody through auditing. You can get somebody upset with you at times if you don't do it right, or especially if there's disagreement as to what's being done. But I'm sure that a lot of the ideas that you've heard about how it has to be done exactly right will tend to evaporate when you look at them. And so the second thing we want to go into is reasons not to do it, reasons not to audit somebody. And we'll see if we can get off any fears or misgivings that people may have about what would happen if they tried to do it. When I first heard about Dianetics and Scientology some years ago, and read books and went to introductory talks and did various things, TR courses and so on and so forth, and at a certain point along that, I decided that not only would I like to get auditing, but what I really wanted to do most of all was to become an auditor. But I didn't tell anybody that when I first thought of it. I decided that, but I didn't want to let on to anyone else initially that I'd decided that I'd really like to become an auditor, in case when I told somebody they might say something to the effect of, you could never be an auditor, or you don't have what it takes, or something to that effect. So it's very possible for people to have misgivings about whether it would be possible for them to be an auditor or not. So the second thing I'd like you to do is to discuss any of those reasons. So just to run over this very briefly again, what we're going to do first, what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask you to split up into twins. You don't have to do any, we don't have to go into any great lengths to do that, either the person sitting next to you or somebody that you came with or whatever's the most convenient. Just turn your chairs so that you're more or less facing each other. And then the first thing I want you to do is for one person to get the other person to tell them whatever happens to be on their mind. And just try listening to it and see how you do it listening to it. Then we'll switch around and have the other person do that. Okay? Okay, so let's do that one. So hi there. Okay. I'm interrupting a few. Really? So, for those of you that haven't quite finished yet, I just want to check and see how it's going. You can carry on if you're in the middle of something really interesting. Did you all get to do it both ways? Yeah. That was listening, right? Right. Now, what about the other one, the drill of discussing what would happen if you did audit somebody? You didn't do that. Well, we could give it a try anyway. We won't make it what would happen if you listened to somebody because you've already done that part. But maybe there's something on what would happen if you audited somebody. Anyway, just before we get into that, let's go over the subject of acknowledgements a little bit. Did you have any difficulty acknowledging what you were listening to? Oh, great. Did anyone have any problem with wondering if they were being heard or acknowledged? Okay. Because you did.
One thing I noticed that it's hard sometimes to just listen, not jump in and give opinions.
Not to give opinions.
Yeah, or ask a lot of questions. To sort of listen
Uh-huh.
and be passive about it as opposed to getting involved in what's going on.
Oh, yeah. Some self-restraint. Your broken knee is not as bad as mine. Or speaking of mother-in-laws, you haven't seen anything. And so on. All right. Now, I hope nobody used any super stiff, too formal acknowledgements like, thank you. Because they need to be broken out of if anybody still has any of them around. Usually a nod or a smile or something to that effect will often result in an acknowledgement and is often very effective. One of my favorite acknowledgements is, I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope it gets better soon. Or some variant thereof. But an acknowledgement is something that you say to convey to the other person, or not necessarily say, actually. Let's get real simple about it. An acknowledgement is something that conveys to the other person that you understood what they said. And it should be done at an appropriate time. You don't have to do it every few words. So, with that in mind, and note we're not into doing any kind of a TR1 thing, or we're not into trying to ask questions as yet. We're mostly still dealing with listening. What I'd like you to do now is to twin up again, and this time I want you to really get into the subject of what would happen if you audited somebody, or reasons not to get involved with auditing somebody, or not necessarily just auditing, but what would happen if you got involved in trying to help somebody, for example, or what might happen, because that is possibly an earlier fundamental reason not to, mix or meddle too much in other people's affairs. So anyway, let's do that one then. Any questions about what we want to do here on this? It's reasons not to audit, or reasons to stay away from it, or the terrible things that might happen if one did, or the dire consequences of meddling in another's affairs. Or perhaps the even more dire consequences of probing into another's mind. I'm not sure whether it's worse for the person being probed into, or it's worse for the prober. I guess it depends what kind of a mind it is you're going into, or what kind of a probe you're using. It reminds me of some of these horror movies, like The Blob and all that. And I guess it's that kind of thing that makes the idea of having anything to do with somebody's mind or past tends to make it scary. It's that sort of, I don't know, maybe science fiction-y or maybe prehistoric monster, or the idea that there's something lurking in the dark in his, in the deep depths of his engrams or subconscious or something that's going to leap up, and next thing there'll be a frothing monster on your hands. Or maybe you'll be a frothing monster. So anyway, that's the idea, is to cover any kind of reason why one might not want to do it, or why there might be a consequence if one did have anything to do with this thing about auditing or helping another person. So let's have a shot at that one, and we'll do it there again. We'll do it both ways, and this time, to give some kind of an indication as to when people are done, when you get done doing that, how about getting up and taking a stroll around, and we'll compare notes on how it went on, and then that'll give other people who are still working on it a chance to finish, and it'll also sort of indicate as to, how many people are done with it. Okay? Great, let's go. Okay, well that went well. At least I think so. All right, did you have any difficulty with anything? Okay, a few people have mentioned some points that they would like me to make, and some of them are very good. If you have anything that comes up during the course of the day that you'd like me to make a comment on, or that might be of interest to others, you could jot it down on a piece of paper and let's see, put it on the desk over there near the door, and I'll grab them and see what we can cover of them. Somebody brought up a point about muzzled auditing, for example, or muzzled TRs, and we're definitely not trying to do muzzled TRs today. We're not into muzzled. Yeah, well, there was a type of, a style, not a type of auditing, but a style of auditing that is sometimes done wherein the auditor is told that he has to be muzzled. In other words, he's not allowed to say anything except the question or the command that he's running, the exact process. And it has its point, but it's so easily misinterpreted that I'd really rather not have anyone try to do it. It can get so outlandish, for example, that the auditor can have this process and he's asking the question and the person can say, it's getting real cold in here, could we turn the heater on? And the auditor freezes into a sort of fixed robotic look and gives the command again, or more often than not actually gets petrified that anything he might do might break this muzzled style. There was one time when people actually do get into that kind of thing when it's drilled in too heavily. There was once when I couldn't read some worksheets that I was trying to CS from a session, and then there was a note from the auditor saying it got too dark. And I think you've guessed, but I followed up on it, and sure enough, they'd been auditing late in the afternoon, and the sun went down, and as the sun was setting, it got darker and darker, and nobody had the presence of mind to reach for the light switch. But actually, it wasn't that they didn't reach for it. It was that the auditor felt that if she turned the light on, that she would have committed some terrible, terrible faux pas of some kind. So anyway, so we're not doing it muzzled. In other words, you can be people, like real people, and you don't want to evaluate for the PC. You don't want to evaluate and you don't want to invalidate. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't respond with some sort of a sensible, normal response. I don't know if sensible was the right word, but a natural response does not go amiss. It's okay. So that's that. Now, who's interested in learning how to do assists? Or, good, or conversely, who feels that they can do assists already? Well, any kind, like a touch assist or contact assist. Are you all familiar with them? I would think so. And then the very first thing we did today was probably the most basic assist of all, which is to, listen to what's on the person's mind or what's concerning them. That's probably the most used and the most effective assist that there is. You can do it at any time, anywhere, and pretty much under any circumstances where somebody has something that's bothering them. And don't underrate its effectiveness. It is tremendously effective. Even aside from the effectiveness of listening to somebody, as I mentioned earlier, that it does give a very stabilizing influence. It does have a very stabilizing influence if a person knows that no matter what happened, there would be somebody he could go tell about it. Whether they could do anything about it or not, if he just knew that there was somebody that he could always talk to, and especially if he knew that there was a group of people among whom he could always find somebody that would be willing to listen to what he had to say. And I guess along with that comes more of the subject of caring that we'd lightly touched on before, and somebody else made a very important point to me this morning, which is that empathy is a higher form of sympathy, and that empathy is a state in which one is willing to duplicate or actually be the other person or experience in some way the other person's feelings and state of mind. It's a willingness to be the other person. Sometimes the term granting of beingness has been used, and that's a very good thing to do, although when people get robotic, I've seen it done mechanically or robotically and not be very effective. But that's actually not granting beingness. What I'm referring to here is where a person says to themselves, I disagree violently with what this person's saying, but probably can't express that, so instead I'll say, well, that may be your consideration about it. or that may be your viewpoint, or worse yet, comes out with some sort of a statement like, well, I'll try to grant you beingness. Or just tries. It would normally be better to communicate. There has been, though, in the past, there has been a sort of coldness, which I hope that we could dispel as we go along here. A coldness between people. A withdrawnness from each other rather than a genuine caring. And anything that you do, or any attitude that you express, which does show a caringness for another person, is very valid and is actually very beneficial. Conversely, anything which gets into the subject of relationships with other people and gets into the subject of auditing, which expresses any form of aloofness or coldness or distance or separateness or uncaringness, anything of that nature, of course, has an adverse effect. It's the opposite of communication, and it's the opposite of being willing to have any part of the ARC triangle. So we're trying basically to increase the amount of aliveness between people by bringing about the components of being alive, which are caring and being friendly and liking or even loving other people, sharing with them, and so on. And those are very valid parts of any type of auditing. We'll cover assists more later, but what we want to do now, and I think we've got time to do it before lunch, in fact I'm sure we have, is we've covered the subject of listening, and then we covered the subject of reasons why not to, so now I'm sure everybody wants to dive in and get their feet wet. Now, nothing that I'm going to teach you to do today is going to be tremendously complex or tremendously difficult, and you should approach it from the point of just doing it very simply. I'm not going to give you any processes that have a long list of commands that you have to remember. Sometimes there are processes that have, say, 2 commands that alternate. There's the first one and the second one, and you're supposed to give them one after the other. And auditors for years and years and years have had to, gone through this nightmare of what if they gave the same command twice instead of the first one and then the second one and then the first one and the second one. And some of them develop tricks like they go, this is the first one, the second one, the first one. Sometimes they sort of write them down on a sheet of paper and they give the first question and the person answers, and then they kind of surreptitiously glance at, is it number 2 or number 1? So we're not going to get into any of that. We're especially not going to have any 5 command processes that you'd have to remember whether you're on command 4 or 5 or 1. So we're not going to do anything complex like that. And actually, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter in what we're doing. It wouldn't matter at all if you did actually give the wrong one. It wouldn't really matter. So I don't want anybody to get into the idea that making a mistake or a flub is going to be the end of the world, because it's not. Those of you who've tried to do auditor training in the past may have gotten that idea, and sometimes with cause, because of the various penalties that have occurred, or the strenuousness with which training has been done at times, and I think often mistakenly, like if the auditor did something that was considered wrong or what's called out tech, anything could happen from him having to redo the entire course or redo it many times through to being declared and expelled, perhaps for all eternity. So watch how you do it. Because that could be the last session you'll ever do. Anyway, I'm sure you've all heard the term out tech, have you? It's a sort of a word that came into being. It's, if anything, it's a kind of a slang word, really. There's a series of slang words that have the words out and in connected to another word. And they talk about out tech or sometimes off, like off policy, or out tech, they're similar meanings. Or in tech, or maybe in that case on policy. But those words are used to mean that something is either in or it's out. Now, depending on how it's interpreted, in tech could mean that you're doing, or the auditor is doing the process in such a way that he won't get into trouble for it. A common interpretation of it. Out tech would be doing something that somebody else could get all over him for doing. It means doing it the wrong way or doing it wrong. Now, the biggest out tech that there is would be not doing any tech. And the biggest in tech that there could be would be doing it. In other words, if tech is in, it's being done or it's being applied. And the either idea is out means it's not being done or it's not in use. And unfortunately, concerns for not doing out tech have often led to complete out tech. No tech at all being applied. It's strange what happens when one tries so hard to prevent something terrible from happening. It's possibly the greatest way of bringing it about that there is. Whether it's walking down the street and trying carefully not to trip in each step, you're bound to fall on your face. Whereas walking really isn't that difficult. So anyway, now, one of the things that perhaps we could have started off with first thing this morning is what are called locationals. And that's what I want to do next. Maybe it's not timely now because everybody's all alive and awake, but I'm sure we can do it a little bit anyway. A locational is any of many types of many processes. It's a type of process. And a locational type of process is one which tends to put the person's attention on the present environment. Anything in the environment, that's a locational. Tends to get the person located where he is, or where he apparently is anyway. Sometimes we are where we are, but we're mostly somewhere else. More likely, under those circumstances, we are not somewhere else, but we're many somewhere else's. And they all get kind of superimposed over each other, so it tends to be a little blurry. Anyway, locationals are things that get a person's attention on the present, especially the present environment, and they have various commands, like there could be a simple
Okay, everybody well fed, rested, ready to roll? Good. David? The floor is yours.
Okay, I want to start off now with a little description of what auditing is. And basically it consists of two people, one of whom communicates to the other person, usually under some form of direction, like being asked a question or given an instruction to carry out. And as a result of that, some charge comes off, what we call charge. For example, some upset or misemotion decreases, or something that the person is having trouble with tends to lessen. Or, in the other type of auditing, positive auditing, there are drills or exercises that the auditor is directing the PC to do and by doing the drill or exercise over and over, the person becomes better at it. So we basically have two types of auditing. The first type that I mentioned is sometimes called negative gain auditing, in that you're trying to get rid of unwanted conditions. The other type is called positive gain because you're trying to improve an ability that the person has. They can't be totally separated in that all auditing contains, or usually contains, some of each. To be more accurate about that, you can't just audit somebody on negative type auditing without also bringing about some positive gain at the same time. So whichever one you're doing, you're likely to run into a little of the other at the same time. And it's usual to try to balance the amount of negative auditing that you do with positive auditing, or at least it works much better that way. One of the things that I think tended to happen as an error in the CSing and programming of cases over the years is it tended to get too much concentrated on negative type auditing. Trying continuously or for too long trying to get rid of unwanted things without at the same time trying to raise the abilities that the person has, or bringing about abilities that the person would like to have. It's necessary to have a balance of the two. That doesn't mean that you have to have 50% of one and 50% of the other. It's simply necessary that one do some of each. For example, if you did all Dianetic type auditing, you'd reach a point where the person got tired of running things out and wanted to do something about, becoming more able in life in some particular capacity. So you just need to balance them so that the person gets both. We did some listening earlier this morning, which is actually primarily a negative type thing. In other words, the person gets to talk about something he's concerned about and get his feelings on that off, or get rid of his feelings on it. It does bring about a positive result, but it is a negatively directed thing. Then we tried out some of these locational processes, which are directed at simply putting the person's attention in the present, which is directed at positive gain. Some techniques or processes tend to include both negative and positive in the same process. But either way, the point that I'm making is that you need to do some of each. So if you're testing auditing out on people, just keep that in mind, and if you get into running things out, then do a process that tends to work on an ability that the person has. I guess I should give some examples so that it's clearer. You could talk to a person or have a person talk to you about upsets that they've had in the past. You could balance that by having them recall times when they were in good communication with other people. That would balance it. You could audit a person on difficulties that they had remembering things. To balance that with something positive, you could have them simply recall things. Wouldn't matter particularly what, but just have them exercise their ability to recall things. Now, some of you may have done Book 1 seminars in the past, and some of you may not know what I mean by a Book 1 seminar or Book 1 auditing. So for those who do, just be patient while I explain it a little. It's basically what we're talking about there is a technique for having a person go back and run out an unpleasant incident by going through it. By going through it enough times so that he runs it out, as we say, gets rid of the effect of it. Now, when you do that type of auditing, in my experience, the main difficulty that people have had with it is when they try to run out too heavy an incident. In other words, they try to go for some very deep and long ago and very heavy incident rather than starting off with a very light incident and working up. In fact, it's usually best to start off with a pleasant incident. This gives a person a chance to get some experience doing it, get some practice doing it, if you like, get used to the idea of doing it. And then if you go from there into heavier incidents, then it gets much easier. So I want to do some of each of those with you, and we'll start with what we call pleasure moments, or pleasant incidents, I guess would be better. We're not particularly looking just for a moment so much as an incident or a time when something happened that was pleasing or pleasant. Now there are two ways to go about doing this. One way would be to get the person to recall such a time and then have him go through it over and over and over. And another way of doing it is over that same incident, that is. The other way to do it would be simply to have him recall times that were pleasant or pleasant memories. And that's the basis of a series of processes called ARC straightwire. They're called ARC straightwire because they deal with times of ARC, or pleasant times, and straightwire because it's a slang term that basically meant like a straight wire from present time to the point in the past. It's basically a recalling type action. Now, getting back to what auditing consists of again, it consists of two people, with one of them asking a question or giving an instruction to the other person, who then carries it out and tells what happened with some form of relief. Now that happens provided the auditor listens and understands what's being said and duplicates and has a friendly and caring attitude. It's not just a matter, it doesn't work just because the person recalled it or went through it, because if that were the case, you could get as much gain or benefit from talking to a wall or just sitting there and thinking of it yourself. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And in the past, I'm sure that you've all heard that or been cautioned not to self-audit. And self-auditing got frowned on, or has often been frowned on. Now, I'm not recommending self-auditing particularly, but just to be real about it, I don't know anybody who hasn't self-audited. So if you have ever self-audited, don't worry about it too much. So is everybody else. And also, it's quite impossible. You know, if you're reading a book or some bulletins and you come across a process, the first thing one normally does is you sort of read it and you kind of get the idea of what that would be like. I think it's impossible not to. It doesn't do any harm, and you might even realize something of it. But to get the full benefit of it, it's better to sit down with somebody else and be able to have somebody there that you can communicate your answers to. So a large measure of why auditing works is because you have another person there who understands what you're relating. That's a very essential ingredient. So when you're trying various auditing techniques on in drills today, or when you're using them in life, remember that the most important thing for you to do is to listen and understand the other person and do it in a friendly manner. That's the most vital thing that you can do. Now, as for things that can go wrong, I'm sure everybody here has heard that you shouldn't invalidate and you shouldn't evaluate, so I don't think I need to, other than mentioning those, put much more emphasis on that. They're of course valid. You should not evaluate and you shouldn't invalidate. Now there are two other things, and I think it boils down to two other things, and I think once you know these two things, I don't think there's really much of any trouble you could get into. may seem oversimplified, but over the years when I've been auditing, it's gone from very complex and very many rules to now where it seems rather simple to me. And one of the things that an auditor can do wrong is he can try to continue doing a process on somebody when he's running something that the person is not interested in. You can try to, sometimes it's described as forcing the PC. You can try to force the PC to run something. You don't even aside from forcing the person, you can, it's incorrect to try to run somebody on something that they just aren't interested in. Not only will it not produce a result, it can after a while get the person maybe at the least frustrated that you're continuing on, and it can get the person quite upset with you. It's very easy to recognize. For example, a person starts yawning and going to sleep, or says, do we have to do this, or how long does this have to go on for before we can end off? It's very easy to recognize. So if you run into that, simply don't continue with it, and you'll get immediate relief. The other thing that you can do wrong is to... That was too easy, huh? The other thing you can do wrong is to ignore something that the person is interested in. Now, a lot of auditors in the past have been trained not to do what the PC tells them to do. And there are various catchphrases about that, and there are various rules and all that. And auditors have often in the past, and I say trained, I mean have really had it drummed into them that they must not do what the PC says. Now there's a difference between the PC trying to write a whole program of processes that's going to be done on his case. There's a difference between that and the PC saying, I'm interested in getting some auditing on the subject of my brother. Or, my knee is sore, can you do anything about it? Now, giving him some auditing on his sore knee is not doing what the PC, it's not following the PC's orders or doing what the PC says. It's a very valid thing, and it's something that you should do. If the PC is very interested in his sore knee, then you shouldn't be auditing him on anything else but that, because that is the thing that he needs auditing on right now. If the PC is interested in improving his memory and tells you about that, then that's what you should audit him on. Now this makes it very easy to decide what process you will use if you're disseminating to somebody. Say you're dealing with somebody that's never had any auditing before, and they tell you, you're talking to them about it, and they say at some point in the conversation, for example, well, I'd be interested in something that would improve my memory. Or they say to you, well, I always have trouble with figures, and I wasn't any good at arithmetic and so on. Is there anything you can do about that, or that could do about that? Well, you already know now what the person needs auditing on and what they should be audited on. Or if they said, I can't stand my boss, would it make it so I could go to work and not hate him all day? He needs auditing on his boss. So just to reiterate those two rules, don't audit the person or don't make the person run something that he's not interested in, and don't ignore something that the person is interested in. And that way you'll win. It's actually perfectly okay to take up and audit somebody on something they are interested in. And almost no matter what process you run on it, you'll almost always get some gain. The more accurate the selection of processes, usually the better the gain, but almost any process run on something that the person is interested in will produce a result. So, we're going to do something real tricky now, and this is usually reserved for extremely high-class auditors and CSs, who, after considerable study and so on, write a mysterious CS, and then you find out what it is and so on. And the idea of it is to find out what needs to be run on a person. Now, I shouldn't put it that way, because there are very skilled things that high-class auditors and CSs do, but it is very easy actually to find out what area of a person's case needs to be handled. Now, this is going to be a real short drill, because I don't think it's going to take very long at all. And we're not really going to do it. The object of this exercise is not to do anything about it. It's just to demonstrate that you can do it. You know, in other words, that you can find out. So what we'll do is we'll twin up again, and the idea is to ask, and you don't have to ask this exact question, there is no exact question, but just ask what the person would be interested in getting auditing on, or any variation thereof. You can't go too far wrong on that one. Just ask the person to tell you what they would like to get audited on, or what they would like to get handled in auditing, and make a note of it, either on a piece of paper or mentally. You don't have to write it down if you can remember it. And it shouldn't be that hard, because we're going to be taking it up again in the real near future. But just ask and find out. And it may take, the person might say, first of all, they might say, well, I'd like to improve this, or no, let me see, I'd rather do that. No, wait a minute, what it really is, I'll tell you something else. So there may be some brief discussion of it, but just find out what the person would like to be audited on. And when you've established that and they're satisfied that they've said what it is, then switch around and do it the other way. And the person who's now the auditor will ask the other person that, and then we'll come back and I'll tell you what we're going to do with it. Once again, as soon as you've completed with that, would you stand up or move so that we can see that everybody's done, and we'll get back going again. Okay, so let's do that one. You done? Anyone who didn't get finished on that? Okay, good. Now we're going to pass out another sheet here, and I ask you to look at about the middle of the page on it. There's a process that we're going to do. The object of that last exercise was simply just to get some subject or area or something that the person would be interested in getting some auditing on. And I don't know whether maybe some people gave a bucket load of them. Because of course it's always possible that, and quite common, that a person would have a lot of things that they would want to improve, which is fine. But we just simply want one of these areas. And in particular for this, we want something that the person, particularly something the person would like to get rid of. And we're going to take the process that I'd like to take here is, or one of them is, about the middle of the page it says, who had that? And it has a blank after it. Somebody's already doing it. Well, before we get, hold on a moment. Anyway, that's what I'd like some of you to do. Now, if you had something that you want to get rid of, or that the PC wants to get rid of, do this one, asking them who had that, whatever it is, and then get them to spot a time when he observed it in somebody else, and then maybe another time when he observed it in somebody else. And you just do that until there's some kind of a realization or a win on it. May not be big, or then again it might be big. But something will happen, and then you can just end it off on that. Now, some of you may not have come up with something that you'd like to get rid of, but may have come up with an ability or the idea of something you would like to improve. And if that's the case, then right above that one, who had that, right above that, there's tell me something you could do. So if you have something you want to get rid of, if your PC has something he wants to get rid of, do who had that. If the PC has something that he would just like to improve as an ability, just do this question, tell me something you could do, and ask that, have the person answer and acknowledge, and then ask it again and acknowledge, and so on, over and over until you get some kind of a win or brightening up. And that's really all there is to that. And once again, if you run into any difficulty, put your hand out and somebody will come and give you a hand. Okay? Won't hold you up any longer. Do you want to give out that third one? I'm going to pass out this third sheet now and find out what's on it. Who's done some kind of Book 1 auditing or some kind of Dianetics or Engram running? Great, that's a lot of people. Who hasn't? Not ever. Okay. All right. Well, on this sheet that's coming out now, there's a very simplified version of that. I'll wait till you get them, till you get the sheets. So there are a series of steps here, numbered 1 through 5. And what I want you to do, is just to drill those steps until you get familiar with them. That'll be our next thing. In other words, I don't want you to try running incidents with them at this point particularly, although if somebody gets them off pat real fast and wants to give it a go, then we could, but I'm not sure if we have time for everybody to do that. We'll see. Maybe that's the test of how fast you can learn. Anyway, what I'd like you to do is to start from this number 1 here, locate an incident, and through 5, and just practice it as a drill with each other and switch around drilling them. And you can just use some imaginary incident or something. Do number 1, locate an incident, and have some imaginary or some inconsequential incident, if you like. And then just practice these as a procedure. Does that make sense? I want you to take these numbered steps 1 through 5 and using an imaginary incident or some very inconsequential incident, just practice drilling these steps on it until you get the feel of it and get familiar with doing it, switch around and practice it the other way. And then when you've done that, if you get through that and you beat everybody else and others are still drilling it, if you want to, while we're waiting for everybody to get through with that, if you want to do something else, you could do the one above it. You could recall some pleasure moments as a process. Okay? Good. Yeah?
Here it says running lock secondary is not inference to start with. We're running imaginary inference. We're just making it up, we're mocking it up. But in here, when you really do that, first of all, you work through the word lock secondary. For the person that you're doing it with, you explain to them what a lock and secondary is, or it happens, or whatever.
No, you wouldn't necessarily. You could if you were doing a formal Dianetic procedure. What we're doing here is we get a list of very simple processes that anyone could do on anyone. And the actual situation under which you'd be inclined, that's more of an instruction to the people here that are learning how to use them, that it's better to start with locks or secondaries. It's not something that you would tell the PC to start with a lock or secondary. So, and in actual practice, when you're dealing with a situation in life where you're going to run some incident out, you don't usually, it wouldn't be appropriate to start clearing what a lock or secondary is. You might be going to run something out, like somebody tripped and fell and hurt themselves, so you'd run it out. You wouldn't, you've got something there to run. You wouldn't clear lock and secondary and then do it. Or whatever's right there, actually. Yeah?
Number 4, where it says arguments, it shows up, are we supposed to qualify whether that's earlier incident or just anything that comes up? Doesn't matter whether it's earlier?
It will be. Actually, there is a situation when it might not be, but that would be okay too. Because the only situation where it wouldn't be an earlier incident would be if you actually finished running out the one that you were working on and something else that needed to be run came up. And then you could just run that.
If you're doing this to somebody, like say they fell, they fell right into this incident, and they didn't really have a sense of getting relief from it, and would you then perhaps ask for an earlier similar?
If it was, the point is that on a very recent incident like that, you almost never have to go earlier. They usually just run out and running them through it. It actually ends up being a lot easier when you do it than most of the difficulties with it are before you do it and wondering. Anyway, what we want to do is just drill it to start with. So don't worry, we're not going to try to run anything yet. Just drill it, get familiar with the commands, and then, as I say, if you get through with that before everybody else does, then do some recalling of pleasure moments on each other and see if that doesn't result in a brightening up of some kind. It's actually, recalling pleasure moments is one of the fastest ways to free up life force or theta on a person. Okay? Good.
Hello? 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 What we're going to do is phase this into break and wander around, get whatever you would like, and we'll probably break. We're running really ahead of schedule, and we'll probably finish off somewhat early. But we might make it back in here, let's say, in about 40 minutes or so. Okay?
So we're moving ahead of schedule a bit. Everybody's been a little faster than I predicted, actually, on doing the various drills and processes, which I guess is a mark of having an able audience. Anyway, it's going very well, I think. What do you think? I had a question that somebody left over there, which I'll take up now. It says the processes we're doing now assume that PC has agreed to be audited, more or less. Is there a way you can recommend to audit without him realizing it? For cases where the PC might resist auditing, in other words, can we be subtle and still be effective? Now, I don't recommend auditing or trying to audit somebody without their knowing that that's what you're doing, or trying to do it subtly or surreptitiously or whatever. And you can have an exception to that, I guess, in the very first thing, that, like the most basic technique of listening to somebody. If you're going to listen to somebody's problem or upset, you wouldn't you wouldn't want to get into a big thing of, is it okay if I audit you? What's auditing? Well, auditing is this thing where, and you explain all that in order to get round to saying to the guy, yeah, do you want to tell me what was bothering you? See, that would be redundant, and I'm exaggerating it to point that out. So if you were going to be listening to somebody tell you about their problem or their concern, by all means simply go ahead and do it, but we're dealing with a situation where the person is in agreement with talking to you and, would agree to your hearing them out. But if you're going to be doing any actual auditing technique other than that, no, don't try to do it without their agreement. If you came across somebody who'd had an accident and you were going to do a touch assist or a contact assist, at least give them a brief explanation of what you're going to be doing. And I mean brief. Especially if the person's hurting right now, you can tell them, look, I'm going to do something here that might help ease this, and then start doing it. You wouldn't, other than a very short, several-word statement, you wouldn't want to get into a long description of this is an assist and the way it works is, or anything like that. You'd go ahead and do it. But you would need you wouldn't do it without the person's agreement. And I definitely don't think it's wise to try to audit somebody without their knowing that that's what you're doing, because that's kind of, that would be kind of sneaky. Wouldn't be upfront and honest. And I think it's far better to be, very open and direct about what you're doing. I'm sure that it would, or it could give a person the idea that you were trying to do something with their mind without their knowing about it, or some such consideration. So anyway, yeah, get their agreement. Now, what you're likely to run into, and I was going to cover a little bit about the subject of dissemination. Of course, one of the big problems with dissemination is not so much finding anyone's ruin as it is handling their considerations about Scientology and what they've heard about it or adverse experiences with it and so on. And I don't have any great words of wisdom on that, except to say that you do need to handle that aspect of it, and the best way is to, find out what the person's heard and listen to them and hear it out and handle their considerations. It's not something that you can handle by avoiding it. It's something you have to handle by diving in, asking them about it, and hearing them out. As for finding a person's ruin, I think the way that that's stated, when it states find the person's ruin, I think that tends to make it sound more difficult than what it is. Today we've done several drills which actually found the person's ruin, although I think ruin is the wrong word to use. When they talk about ruin, what you're really talking about is finding where the person's interest in improving himself is, or what the person wants to get handled about himself. That's all it really boils down to. Usually the person presents you with that. In fact, you don't usually have to start cold looking for what the person wants handled. You're usually in a situation where that's obvious or has already been stated, and all that you have to do really is demonstrate to the person that something can be done about the thing that they want to get handled or improved. So I hope that these various processes and things that we've been going over today would give you something that when you run into a situation like that with somebody, you can give them an actual demonstration there on the spot and say, well, this process may help a little, or may show you what we can do about it. Run it, the person feels somewhat better about it, or sometimes spectacularly better about it. And then you can indicate that that was done by way of demonstration, and then direct the person to a professional auditor or centre for further auditing. Or if you want to take the person further, then get professionally trained so that you're more familiar with what to do. I started off, my first contact with the subject of Dianetics was through somebody who knew very little about it, apart from the fact that he'd read a couple of books and he'd been reading some magazines or auditors' bulletins that were being released in the late 50s. And there's one of the processes on these sheets here is tell me something that might have happened today. And I put that on there because that was actually my first contact with the subject, and I thought I'd mention it. This person actually saw me doing some yoga exercises and commented on that and said, you know, I'm doing something, or I'm getting interested. He told me that he'd done some of that too, but he was getting interested in this new thing he'd heard about called Dianetics, and he told me briefly about it, and I wanted him to do some of it on me. He kept talking about these n-grams, and I had to find out what do you mean by n-gram. And he started explaining something about incidents in the past, and about that point I said, well, go on, do it. You know. He didn't know how to do that, but that's running an incident, but he had read this process in one of the magazines that he'd read, and he couldn't remember what it was, so he went rummaging around and found the magazine, and it had on that, tell me something that might have happened today. And he said, oh yeah, that's what it was. So I said, well, try that then. And I basically talked him into doing it. And he started running it. He started asking me, tell me something that might have happened today, and I remember I started giving him answers like, well, I could have fallen off my bicycle and broken my neck and, you know, died. Or, come to think of it, I might have skidded under a truck and got run over. And, you know, it ran like that. It had all the first set of answers, I remember all sorts of terrible catastrophes that could have occurred. And I remember he started panicking a little bit because he thought this was, you know, sounded a little too negative, I guess. And then he remembered that you were supposed to keep doing these things until they went flat. And he told me that, and we discussed that, and we tried to figure out what would they mean by flat. And we agreed that we didn't know what that meant. But whatever it meant, we figured, you know, the idea of, you know, thinking of falling under a truck, that probably wasn't flat. So we went on doing it some more, and then we both noticed, and actually we discussed it quite a lot during the process. We were both commenting on the answers I was getting from time to time. And I remember at one point I commented to him that, you know, I noticed that I'd been thinking of these very negative things that could have happened, very serious catastrophes, and now my answers were changing to a different line. He said, oh yeah, he said, you seem to be doing, you know, and we had a great discussion about it. I didn't do any harm or anything. It wasn't even particularly evaluative. I'm just mentioning it because we often get the idea that auditors shouldn't talk at all. and that isn't true. Particularly if the PC has a question, it's real good to answer their question. And it's real dumb not to. And especially if somebody asks you an intelligent question and you say thank you and give them So, don't feel you have to do that. If it really doesn't make sense, don't feel that you have to do it. Anyway, we discussed these and we carried on running this process, tell me something that might have happened today. And as I'm sure you can guess, the answers gradually went up tone. And quite unexpectedly, because we didn't know anything about a tone scale or really much about it at all, about auditing or anything. And the answers went up tone, and I started realizing that, all sorts of good things could have happened. And we both thought that was hysterically funny. And we thought that was very interesting and talked about it. And then we realized, hey, that's probably flat. So there isn't a great deal of trouble you can get into with these. And it is a lot of fun. Anyway, that's why that one happens to be on the list. Now, what I want to do next is I want to get you to do some kind of simplified book one using these commands that we've got here. And you don't all have to do it. I know some people would probably feel that they'd rather not run through incidents, and that would be okay if you don't want to. But anyone could do it, actually. The most trouble that people are likely to get into running incidents or book one is if they try to get into or try to run some incident that they can't find or that's too steep. The easiest way to do it is usually the most effective and best. Now, if somebody's in the middle of some other kind of auditing and they don't want to do this, that's fine. You could do something else. But those of you who aren't in the middle of something else and want to have a crack at it, by all means do so. So what we'll do is get those of you that want to do this to twin up, and we'll start off by locating an incident, and start off by locating some incident that is either a pleasure moment or a pleasure incident, or at least is a relatively innocuous occurrence. And by that I mean something like maybe if somebody has an incident when they got a bicycle when they were a kid and they wanted a bicycle and got a bicycle for their birthday, that would be what I mean by a pleasure incident. You could run through that and all sorts of interesting things would happen, like maybe some memory increases and so on. But it's a good way to learn doing it. Don't go particularly looking for an n-gram, although I'd never stop anybody from doing this, but it's where most people get their losses in trying to do auditing, is where they look for a heavy n-gram to run out. Like the time when you got your tonsils out or whatever. They don't make the best incidents to start off with on this type of procedure. Although I read Dianetics when I was still at high school, and we used to run Dianetics during lunch hours, myself and other kids. And it's a story I often like to tell because it was spectacular, but one of the kids at high school he'd been thrown by a horse into a barbed wire fence, which tore his leg open. And we used to run this incident during lunch hours, and there were other incidents that we used to run there were about half a dozen of us that got into running these Dianetic incidents during lunch time. And this particular person was the most popular PC, and this incident of the horse was the most popular incident. Because when he ran through it, his leg, when it would get torn on the barbed wire fence, used to go like that. And, it looked spectacular. I mean, who's going to run somebody through, his grandmother dying and his grief on that when you can watch some guy go, here I am on the horse, and I'm going for the thing, and So, you can run incidents that are painful too if you want, but, they're harder to do. Anyway, and then the lunchtime would be over, 1 o'clock would come, so everybody would jump up and run off. Anyway, it is possible, you see, the only reason I'm mentioning that is not good procedure, but it is possible to run an incident on more than one occasion. You don't have to flatten it all in one sitting. You don't have to at all, actually. And I think that incident got run by several different people during many different lunch hours. And eventually it ran out. And it was very impressive because, not just because of the twitching leg, but because of the fact that this guy had been quite successful in sprinting events and sports. Prior to the injury with the horse, the incident got run out and he recovered from a limp and started running and started winning races as a runner again. So, it was quite an impression was created by that to all concerned. Anyway, so those are some little interesting anecdotes. What I suggest we do now then is those of you who want to run some incidents, start off at least with some incident that was pleasurable, run that through until you feel happy about that, and then if you'd like to go into something else, like maybe some minor upset or loss or something like that, then give that a try. Once again, if you need any help, stick out your hand and somebody will give you some help with that. Those of you who don't particularly want to do that, do something else. Watch other people. Give helpful comments. We'll do this for a limited period of time. We won't run it by because it's such a variable as to how long each person would take. And the object of the exercise today is to get some experience doing it, rather than, try to flatten anything. So what we'll do is we'll run this until, we'll do, say, 30 minutes on it approximately, which means 4:15. And then we'll end off on that. And I've got one more thing after that, which we will do. So let's do this one until, say, 4:15, and then we're going to end it whether you're ready or not. Okay? Good. So how did that go? How many people ran incidents? Okay, great. Well, everybody did, very well today. I tried to make sure that we covered some of every type, which we've done. There's a possibility that we could do one more thing, which is actually a bit of a reiteration of some of what we've already done, or else we could wrap it up. I'm interested to know what the consensus of opinion is. So how many of you would like to run another process? Okay, and how many wouldn't? Okay, goodbye. All right, well we'll do one more then, and or one more of these things. It's similar to what we've been doing, perhaps a little different. There's on one of these pages down toward the bottom, there's one that has what kind of a mock-up should you put up, etc. Do you all find it? Okay. So a few people have asked me already, but this one's not a creative process as such. It doesn't ask you to create something or mock it up. It does, you have the word mock up in it, but that doesn't make it creative. If it was mock up a football or a truck or something, it would be. What this is designed to do is to get a person to sort out their considerations or attitudes about the things that are mentioned in it. And it's a type of process that, some interesting things can happen on in terms of changes of considerations or cognitions that may occur. So what we'll do is get each of you to run that process. It has those 4 commands, which you run 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the auditor's old dilemma. How do you remember which one you're on? And I leave that up to you. If you get it wrong, PC can tell you. It actually doesn't matter if you try to do them in that sequence over and over, 1, 2, 3, 4, but if you do one twice or skip one once, it's really not going to make any difference. So anyway, that's a very good one to do because something little might happen on it, but then again something big might. And then following that is recall some space, and is it too much or too little? Those last 4 on the bottom of the page, what I would like you to do is to start with that one, what kind of a mock-up should you put up, and run that, and if nothing spectacular occurs, go to the next one, and the next one. And if you get a big win on one of these, then don't go on through the rest, just leave it at that, and switch around and the other, have the other twin become the auditor and the other one the PC. Okay? So anyway, it's not these aren't, one's a recall process, the recall some space, but what's common to each of these 4 processes is they have to do with the person's own universe and how much, his considerations to do with it or how much space he can have in it and so on. And they're the kind of process that, once again, that anyone can do anywhere on the grade chart and can bring about a shift. They're not actually so much because they're not directed toward handling some specific case condition. They're the type of process that deals with you personally or you as a being and can result in a resurgence of an ability. So we'll do those, and yes?
How many times do you run this before you go on to the next one?
Each of them is run to a point where the person either brightens up or if nothing's happening on it, you just agree to leave it and go to the next one. Like the 2 rules I mentioned earlier, one of them is you don't continue to do something if the guy isn't interested in it. So, any other questions before we start? The subject? I'm not sure I understand.
What kind of a mock-up should you put up? Mock-up of what?
Why, that's really what the question's asking. Well, it would, yeah. Yeah, very definitely. But that's what the PC has to answer, what kind of a mock-up.
This must be a process in the middle of another process or something, or it follows another process?
No.
Just a cold call.
It's just cold. You just do it. Well, mock-up is simply something that you create. And I don't know about put up, you think? Put up is just the usual meaning of put and up. Now, people feel, you'll find that I think it's a little more easy to run than it looks. People tend to feel that there's some kind of a mock-up or creation that they should put up, or I guess present would be another way to put it. And if you look at that, you'll get to see, well, what it is that you have in mind. And your ideas on that may change. I think it's better just to do it rather than try to clarify it any further now. And if you have difficulty trying to do it, then put your hand out and we'll handle it on an individual basis. Yeah, there's another question. We'll handle those on an individual basis, I think. And, what?
He was just waiting for the nod to begin.
Oh, he's ready to go. Okay. Okay, and we'll do this for say 20 minutes. I think 10 minutes each way would be adequate. Okay, so we'll end off at 7:45. What? Well, I think everybody's finished off. Okay. Yes? No? Pardon? Okay. Yeah, continue it later. There you go. So what we were really trying to accomplish today was to get you some experience at using these as an auditor. And if you got anything out of them, the processes case-wise, then that's a little extra on the side. So how do you feel that you did on it? Great. And there were actually very few questions. In fact, I didn't get any questions about those processes. So I think everybody dived in and did them. It's real interesting that auditing is actually very easy to do, especially when you realize that it really boils down to the ability to be able to listen to somebody and just pay attention to what they say and understand it, and to be able to ask somebody a question. And one of the things that people are very good at is talking about themselves. So that ability is already there, and it does do a lot of good. Anyway, I hope that you'll use these from time to time in the future, whenever the situation arises, and get more confidence. And once again, I want to reiterate that what we've done today doesn't substitute for professional training, but it does give you something that you can do in everyday situations in life, on, say, friends and family and acquaintances and so on. So, I'm very pleased with how it went, and Gerald's going to take over now, and going to be asking you if you could jot some answers to questions down on pieces of paper to give us a commentary on what you thought of it and so on, that we can use to improve any future events and seminars. So thank you all for being good auditors and PCs and students and so on, and I hope we can do something like this again.